Hey, really quickly before I start this video, the B-roll of Monster Hunter Wilds in the beta was sent to me by the wonderful Miss 5000 Watts. Go ahead and give her a big old thanks. Anyway, roll the video. So from the top of this video, I wanted to preface this by saying that this video is a piece of sponsored content on Monster Hunter Mobile, aka Monster Hunter Outlanders, which normally I wouldn't do because I don't tend to cover mobile games. However, maybe that's a change given everything that's happened recently, but I don't plan on continuing to cover a ton of mobile games as a general rule. However, after talking to the sponsors in question and saying that if I was going to do this, I'd like to focus more of the content on what I usually talk about, they were receptive to the idea. Sometimes sponsors are ironclad in what they want out of a channel, which is a really big turn-off for me and a common reason why I turn quite a few sponsorships down. In many instances, you guys are not going to get much out of a reaction video from something that I've never heard of. However, in this instance, the sponsors over at Capcom and Timmy were willing to actually allow me to diverge from what they originally had planned. And kudos to them for that, because it requires a bit of trust in the creator in question, and also an appreciation for the kind of content that they're making. As it happens, I was also planning on releasing a much larger video in the coming weeks about the story of Monster Hunter games generally, and the way things tend to shape up in their lore. So today's video is going to be an interesting prelude to that, if nothing else. With that in mind, we'll be looking at some of the pre-released stuff from Monster Hunter Outlanders, and talking for just a second about why the game has a really interesting bit of story potential, and some story content that players might want to jump into if they're deciding to take the plunge. Before we get into that, I think there's something to be said for asking if the formula for Monster Hunter Outlanders has changed significantly or not from the main games. I'm talking about combat, weapon sets, movesets. Astoundingly, it seems like the game devs at Capcom and Timmy have actually been able to preserve some of the core elements of the combat system that are quite recognizable. I think that matters because Monster Hunter's moment-to-moment gameplay is more connected to its narrative, or the version of a narrative that the game has, than almost any other game, and that's because the monsters in the world are the story, something I'll touch on in my larger video. But to put it frankly, the monsters here, yeah, they're kind of the same as what you would expect from Monster Hunter World. There's a big open world with a handful of biomes and lots of reactive monsters that act pretty much as you would expect. The environment in itself is also reflective of the monsters that you'll see in-game. In fact, I think it's fair to say that if you squint, it'd be fair to say that they're pretty close to their counterparts in Monster Hunter World, which is the obvious well from which a lot of the catalogue of monsters is currently being drawn. The major change mechanically is with the host of a cast of characters with their own kits that do all the hunting, which, yeah, I guess that tracks for a mobile game. That should also give you an idea of whether this is for you or not, because for me at least, I'm a little tired of hero characters in any format and genre, but personal preference and spending habits will differ from person to person. You do you. You know what you want, you know what you can handle. However, at least the core gameplay side of it looks like it's mostly unchanged, and is aiming to preserve the core part of what Monster Hunter's combat feels like. There are also a lot of notes from some of the materials that were released to me as a part of this sponsorship that this is thanks to, well, oversight from Capcom. The developers were getting constant oversight on the game, and it does make sense. Capcom has been refining their combat sandbox for decades now, and the reveal made it really clear that the focus from Timmy was on creating an authentic Monster Hunter experience, just on a different platform. This matters because the world and the monsters you encounter in a Monster Hunter game represent the core pillars of its narrative, as I said. It's actually one of the biggest points that I'm going to make in my other large video, that at some point I'll release soon, which is that the world of Monster Hunter is as much of a character as anyone or anything in it. Often, I actually think it's the most valid perspective when playing Monster Hunter to view the world as the main character in all of this, with all of the smaller monsters that end up being either just set dressing all the way up to your massive flagship monsters as being just a part of the world's true story. Little moving pieces and parts, maybe even comparable to emotions or themes. From this fundamental understanding, a lot of the narrative of Monster Hunter really flows, and in this sense, the foundations could well hold true in this game based on what we've seen from the pre-release footage, because again, the monsters and the world are doing exactly what they do in other Monster Hunter games. But there's more information that came with all of the assets for this sponsor, and I wanted to highlight some of it because it actually takes us to some places that are a little unexpected for a Monster Hunter game's narrative. Things that I didn't initially expect, and based on some of the things I'm hearing about the game, there's interesting stuff going on behind the scenes. The first thing worth mentioning comes from the developer previews for the game and from the trailers. It's in those trailers and those previews that you can see that some of the monsters have been changed by this strange material that's on the ground. They've been mutated by the environment. The trailer in particular shows off a mutated Rathian, which has patches of color across its hide. Really bright color, not typical for what it actually looks like. This, in itself, revisits what I think is one of the most interesting stories of all of Monster Hunter, which can be found in Monster Hunter 4. In this, we see a pretty typical plot point for Monster Hunter games generally. The world has suffered an event that has put it out of balance. In Monster Hunter 4, it appears to be because something is driving the monsters of the world utterly mad. Upon investigating further, it is revealed that there's some kind of corruption that's infecting monsters and causing them to become unnaturally aggressive and even stronger. This is revealed to be something known as the Frenzy Virus, which is the cause for new variants of monsters to appear in the world, all of which are tainted by its influence. Now, in pretty typical Monster Hunter fashion, we find out that the cause of the Frenzy Virus is a monster that's disturbing the local ecosystems, namely the Gore-Magala and the Shagaru-Magala, which it later morphs into. It appears that the mutations that the Rathian is suffering from in Monster Hunter Outlanders and the previews for it is something that's vaguely comparable. It looks like a departure from the natural order that you'll need to resolve. Stories like this are interesting because they ask us to examine our place in the world, and they confront us with a question, namely whether our part within the natural order of things is to be the arbiters over the world that maintain it, or whether we have to accept that we are also a part of the natural order of the world, and that trying to intervene and intercede on its behalf is actually going to make things worse. Are we above nature, or are we just another part of it? We inevitably put our thumbs on the scale when we take actions to try and make things better, and the result is either that things do get worse or that something completely unexpected happens, but in most instances, acting actually throws things even more out of balance. In this instance, the supposed corruption of the monsters in Outlanders is all taking place in the open-world island destination where the game is happening, so it's separate from the old world and the new world where the Monster Hunter games thus far have taken place. This makes the mutation here a novel threat, but notably the corruption isn't due to the Frenzy Virus like it was in Monster Hunter 4. Instead, it's due to the presence of a unique mineral compound that you can see in the trailer and which is all over the pre-release materials if you look for it, and is referred to as, and I don't know if this is the correct pronunciation, but here we go with it, Radianium. I know, it's very unobtainium vibes. For whatever reason, this Radianium isn't easily identified within the trailer, but I think it'd be fair to anticipate that its source will probably be the true final boss monster or perhaps the flagship monster of the game. Dropping corruption like this is a sure way to influence the environment, and the guild has an active interest in making sure that the world remains in relative balance, so eliminating this monster and culling those monsters that have been mutated is going to be a priority for certain. However, thanks to this being a sponsored video, I also have some additional information about all this, and this is where things get interesting to me, and where they potentially diverge a little bit. Because, well, there is the potential for it. You see, there's two parts of all this that you can either speculate about or which are directly expanded upon, which I think add a little bit of relevance. The first of these is that the Radianium is something that isn't just influencing local fauna, it's also influencing local culture. Now, to be really clear, this could be a nothing burger, it could be something as small as a note saying that it's a great place to find your local colony of felines. However, if there is a more established island culture, which I don't think is at all impossible given Monster Hunter, and if they have been influenced by radianium, I imagine that means that the mineral has been around for a long time, and that they've been exposed to it for an equally long time. Cultures are changed over generations by the materials that surround them, so this indicates a sort of longevity to this mineral's presence on the Outlanders island. And yet, the mutation seems as though it's unnatural, not part of the status quo, so something has happened here. This also matters in the context of the second thing that I think is important, namely that this island is undiscovered so far, and therefore potentially holds ancient ruins, technology, and undiscovered monsters. More importantly, as a kind of addendum and as big speculation for all of this, if radianium is something only found on this island, then it's possible that it links to something we've never seen before. This is our interesting connection point, and I think it's there that I want to pick up on things in terms of old Monster Hunter possibilities. Because yeah, it is possible that this is a big monster, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but I also think that this could be a result of the ancient civilization. Yeah, we're going to touch on that little bit of lore, because this, I think, really could go either way. Now, again, it's really typical Monster Hunter story fashion to just see that the source of all the disruption in the narrative is in itself just an incredibly powerful boss monster whose impact on the ecosystem is really profound. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if that was what was happening here at all. Radianium might just be the residue of a mountain-sized Elder Dragon, and yeah, those definitely exist in Monster Hunter. Those of you who've played Monster Hunter World might only be familiar with Zorah Magdaros, Kolvataroth, or maybe Xeno'jiiva, Safi'jiiva, but to be honest, they are not the only ones of their type. Facing down monsters of magnificent size like that is actually a staple of the series, and it goes all the way back to the first iteration of a truly magnificently sized monster, which is the Laoshan-Lung. I hope I am not butchering that pronunciation. The staple of the series that started all of this, the translation of that title that it has into English literally calls it the Old Mountain Dragon. And that's before we get into the truly massive creatures from previous games. Because if you think Zorah is big, just wait until you realize how big Zhenmoran is. Essentially, it's a land whale that is big enough to give Shai-Hulud a run for its money. And don't even get me started on the fact that the Rotten Vale from Monster Hunter World is made up of the corpses of two massive Delamadors. You heard me correctly there. Two of these Elder Dragons basically make an entire biome. If you're not seeing the solid floor of the acid lakes from all of the rotten flesh beneath, that then flow into the Elder Channels and all that, yeah, you're seeing a massive carcass for what is essentially the biggest land snake, something that is so huge that it coils around mountains. So yeah, massive monsters absolutely on the table. However, what might be completely unique here is the other note that I mentioned earlier. Radianium has impacted local cultures as well, and this makes me think that there is something else going on. Because in most instances, it's unlikely that most cultures or societies would be able to survive in the shadow of a massive Elder Dragon. If radianium is left by a monster, that means that it must be as ancient and as predictable as the tides for the local island culture to have survived. But let's entertain that slightly different possibility for a second. What if this isn't a monster? What if this is something ancient, but ultimately man-made instead, as a result of the ancient civilization? And I should probably just do a little addendum here. For those of you who don't know about the ancient civilization from Monster Hunter's lore, it's fascinating. I think it's personally my favorite aspect of the entire lore of the franchise. It's clearly a civilization that grew decadent with time, had advanced technology, built magnificent structures, and ultimately forced the world into chaos and ruin. Hence why you can see the ruins of the old world all around us, and why Monster Hunter's mainline games are filled with these old temples that kind of have no purpose or are lost to time. The key point about the ancient civilization, though, is that they didn't care for the natural order, and realized too late that they were also a part of it and they were not immune to its laws. With that theme in mind, the idea of radianium has the weird potential to veer outwards from the typical Monster Hunter formula and involve the ancient civilization directly, perhaps as a remnant or byproduct of it. The key factors in my mind for this are the use of the word mutation to describe how the monsters are changed, and the fact that the local cultures are supposedly being morphed by this as well. For an entire culture to have been influenced by this resource means that it must have been around for a while. After all, societies are defined by the kind of natural resources that they have in the world around them, and if the society has been built up around radianium, it's possible that it predated them. Failing that, if it has started influencing the society, it would likely be the case that it did so starting at some kind of well-recorded and inscribed historical moment, or at very least that it's been going on so long that it's just a part of things that is naturally accepted. Furthermore, for monsters to have been mutated by it implies yet again that change as an active result of something that has interfered with the status quo, be it natural or otherwise. In both instances, a monster might have been the cause, but with how this is changing the natural world around it, I think it would be a really interesting and novel moment in which we could see that this is actually a strange amber-colored crystal that's a residue of the ancient civilization instead. And that would be a really neat evolution to the narrative of most Monster Hunter games, and it would touch upon a cool part of the lore that most games don't explore actively. Perhaps radianium was a power source or a byproduct of their old industry, and interacting with it as part of the natural world drives one mad. This plays interestingly into Monster Hunter's core themes to boot, because again, the ancient civilization fell in part because they disrespected the world around them and believed themselves to be above its natural order, elder dragons and all. If something is mutating and changing the monsters, and if it's even changing the local culture, that means it might be something outside the cycle of nature entirely, just like the customs of the ancient civilization. If so, that gives us as hunters a clearly defined problem that we need to fix. I imagine that this will inevitably be a monster, but there's always the chance for the two to intersect. Perhaps this was a large elder dragon where radianium was a byproduct of its own treatment as a species during ancient times. Maybe this is as a result of interacting with ancient civilization ruins that still contained some of their technology. This works narratively because radianium might represent a force that acts as a direct confrontation against the force of nature of the world and the natural order of things more generally, thus making it a priority target for hunters to eliminate, or at very least to cull those monsters that have been affected by it. This is a lot of analysis and examination over a mobile game, that much is certain, but Monster Hunter's story has always been secondary to its gameplay and has quietly been in the background, preaching this sort of quiet wisdom about the nature of the natural world. I've always appreciated that as someone who digs deep into the narrative of things, and it allows us to examine our own actions further within the game, and to assign purpose to our place within this world. The cool thing is that despite the fact that this is a mobile game, there are clear signs that the Capcom team is trying to push for that same vision of what their narrative might become to be preserved within the world of Monster Hunter Outlanders. If that's the case, awesome. Whether or not people pick this up and play it, I do hope that attention to detail like this isn't lost in the process. It'd be nice to get a nuanced Monster Hunter story regardless of the medium, and it'd be interesting to see them expand into new areas of lore regardless of where it comes from. And heck, if the gameplay and if the narrative around it is decent, which, you know, still unfounded, there's no way of telling at this moment, but if it is good, then maybe it's a jumping point in for new players as they explore the mainline offerings of the series at large. After all, there is another game on the wild horizon that's coming up very soon, so maybe we'll have more to talk about. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. Thanks to Monster Hunter Outlanders for sponsoring this video. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like and leave your own thoughts down below in the comments section. I personally have always wanted more stuff on the ancient civilization, but Monster Hunter has always been very unwilling to show it directly in that sense. I'd love to see that change, but would you? And of course, if you want more stories from worlds near and far, go ahead and hit subscribe and the bell next to subscribe to turn on those email notifications. But as per usual, know that your viewership, as always, is quite enough for me. And that in the meantime, my name is Bife. Rhodacia ad Astra. I'll see you, Starside.